Australia's political leaders have joined with people around the world to mark the 10th anniversary of the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Can you believe that was a decade ago? Those disastrous events transformed America's foreign policy and its military strategy in the months and years afterwards. But it was the nation's intelligence agencies that faced the greatest shake-up. They were slammed for failing to connect the dots that might have prevented 9/11. Billions of dollars have been spent reforming America's intelligence processes, but there are still questions about just how safe the US is. Here's North America correspondent Lisa Miller.
Secrets were once tightly held in this city. Gathering critical information may have been a global operation, but sharing it was a struggle. And the turf wars here in the nation's capital led to catastrophic events.
These engines and this landing gear were found several blocks from the site. The force of the impact obviously scattered pieces everywhere. These are parts of the plane.
September 11 was the FBI's biggest case. Once evidence, these are now museum artefacts on display. Engines from Flight 175 that crashed into the second tower, credit cards from a mother taking her daughter to Disneyland, and victims' cell phones and pages that rang till their batteries died.
We tell the story of how the FBI and the CIA were both criticized for failing to share intelligence that might have prevented the attacks.
The intelligence failures scarred this country. The past decade has been spent trying to ensure it won't happen again.
I believe we're safer because I think organizations are working together and acting on information that they had but didn't act on prior to then.
Do you think there'll be another attack?
I think it's inevitable. We have a lot of enemies.
There are a lot of scary people out there, so I think it's always going to be a possibility.
Michael Chertoff was at his desk at the Justice Department on September 11. As head of the criminal division, he led the government's initial response to the attack.
But 10 years on, do you look at that photo and still feel something, or...?
Yeah, I remember very vividly what it was like, and I remember seeing pictures of people jumping out of windows. I mean, it's really a nightmare to imagine being trapped in the towers. This is not an occasion for undue anxiety. It's an occasion...
3 years later, he was running the newly created Department of Homeland Security, a government bureaucracy with an annual budget of $55 billion and 250,000 staff.
Would it surprise me to see more small-scale attacks or Mumbai-style attacks or attacks in movie theaters or shopping centres? No, it wouldn't surprise me.
The US prides itself on the number of foiled terror plots in the last decade, as many as 39, including the attempted bombing in Times Square. But authorities missed the radicalisation of Army Major Nidal Hasan before he shot and killed 13 people at Fort Hood. And they admitted failing once again in the skies above Detroit when a Nigerian tried to detonate explosives he'd hidden in his underwear. Success would have been catastrophic. 10 years on, is America any safer?
We're clearly much safer, and it's much harder to smuggle operatives into the U.S. Who are trained and going to carry out a large-scale attack. So to that extent, we've reduced the risk. But the consequence of that is the enemy has now looked at recruiting people in place.
I think the kind of mismanagement and failure to communicate that preceded the original 9/11 attacks is much less likely now. So in that sense, I think we are in better shape.
Greg Thielman spent 30 years in government, including senior roles in the State Department's Bureau of Intelligence. He understands the world of secrecy and covert operations.
We have to expect that we will continue to be surprised, and that we should not expect too much of the intelligence community in laying out the future. The crystal ball is always very murky.
The September 11 Commission made 41 recommendations, including the creation of a mega intelligence agency to oversee the various branches and encourage information sharing. Fixing basic communication problems that stopped firefighters radioing police officers at Ground Zero. Ending the use of fraudulent IDs and overhauling airport security. 5 of the 19 hijackers boarded their plane at Dulles International despite setting off metal detectors. 30 minutes later, they plunged the American Airlines jet into the Pentagon. Security here and at airports across the country has been transformed, but the system remains vulnerable. Bomb technology has increased at a greater rate than the machines designed to detect them.
Our conclusion is that despite 10 years of working on the problem, the detection system still falls short in critical ways with respect to detection.
The 9/11 commissioners have delivered their report card on the decade. At least 9 of their recommendations are incomplete or have been ignored, including reform on Capitol Hill. The Homeland Security Department is still forced to answer to 100 different committees.
It means that the Homeland Security Department spends so much time preparing and testifying that they're not spending enough time protecting us, which is the prime job.
Behind me, here in the suburbs of Virginia, is the new front line in America's security efforts. It's the National Counter-Terrorism Centre, and its creation was a recommendation of the 9/11 Commission. We can't get any closer. In fact, we've already been stopped by police. But inside are staff from 16 different intelligence agencies, all working together to try and keep those communication lines open.
The centre's director was meant to be a powerful leader who had the ear of the president, but the position has failed to live up to expectations. 4 men have already held the job in just 6 years.
I think the breaking down of barriers is one of the most conspicuously successful aspects of intelligence reform, but in terms of some of the other areas, including the powers of the Director of National Intelligence, there is still some room for improvement there.
Osama bin Laden's death changed the story that might have been told this anniversary. Al-Qaeda is a different beast to the one that attacked a decade ago. But America remains a country at risk.
We need to make sure we don't get so mired in the tactical, looking at the next threat matrix, that we lose sight of the strategic picture. What is what's going on in the so-called Arab Spring mean? Is it good? Is it bad? How do we deal with it? What does that mean in terms of terrorism?
Complacency could be the biggest threat.